audience. Following that, we'll stop and we'll have a book signing with Kristen, and we'll do obviously our traditional photo before we end for the night. So Kristin Henning is a nationally recognized advocate, author, trainer, and consultant on the intersection of race, adolescence, and the policing of Black youth. She is the Blume Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic initiative at Georgetown Law, and was previously the lead attorney of the juvenile unit at the Public Defender's Service for the District of Columbia. Chris has been representing children accused of crime for more than 26 years and is a co-founder of a number of initiatives to combat racial injustice in the juvenile criminal legal systems, including the Ambassadors of Racial Justice Program and a Racial Justice Toolkit for Youth Defenders. Chris also trains state actors across the country on the impact of racial bias on youth in the courts and the traumatic effects of over-policing and hyper-surveillance. She has received several awards, including the 2021 Leadership Prize from the Juvenile Law Center and the 2022 Women of Distinction Award from the American Association of University Women. Chris has written many articles and other publications advocating for reform in the juvenile legal system. Her recent book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, was featured on the front page of the New York Times Book Review and received rave reviews in the Washington Post. The book was awarded a 2022 Media for Just Society Award by the Evident Change and the 2022 Social Justice Advocacy Award from In the Margins Book Awards Committee. At this time, let's give a big round of applause to our guest speaker tonight, Kristin Henning.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ishmael, for inviting me. I'm so glad to be here with you all. And I want to jump right in because I want to create as much space for us to have a conversation with all of you about these issues. So, as Dr. Ishmael said, I am a professor at Georgetown Law School, and I take my third-year law students into DC Superior Court to represent children accused of crime. I have been representing children in the nation's capital for the last 26 years. But what is so disturbing about what I do is that in that entire 26 years, I have only represented 4 white children. That is it. Every other child that appears in the courthouse with us is an African-American child, right? And so you might be thinking, well, maybe there aren't any white kids in Washington, D.C. proper. We know that's not true. You might be thinking that white kids do not commit crimes in Washington, D.C. We also know that is not true. So it became very hard for me to continue to do this work without stopping to think about why it is that these extreme racial disparities exist, not just in Washington, D.C., but all across the United States. It also became difficult for me to continue to do the work without really thinking about how this criminalization of Black kids, right? The over-policing in many ways of many Black children was impacting Black children physically, mentally, psychologically, developmentally, and I wanted to know if this differential treatment of Black kids and other kids is not justified, right? It's not right. Then what do we do about it as a society? And so I think the best way for me to share what I found as I began to do this research is to tell you a story. And I know some of you have started to read the book, my book, The Rage of Innocence, but for those of you who haven't or who have not gotten to the story, I tell about a child named Sharice. Sharice was a 17-year-old girl that we represented who got into an argument with her boyfriend. During the course of the argument, she was convinced that her boyfriend was cheating on her. So she grabbed her boyfriend's cell phone out of his hands and began to walk away down the hall. As she's walking away, she's scrolling through his text messages to see whether or not he's been communicating with anyone else. A school police officer sees this and decides to intervene. Anybody want to guess how he intervened? Hello, right? He arrests her, right? Arrests her in the hallway in front of her friends, in front of her teachers, and this child got held in detention overnight, brought to court the next day, and was charged with robbery, right? For taking the property of another by stealth or force. And so now on paper, I am representing the 17-year-old child who looks like a violent felon, on paper only, right? Because we know that she was just a teenager, being a teenager, having an emotional reaction to what was happening in her life at the moment. So when I, talk about the arrest and the prosecution and the detention of children in our country, people automatically assume that I must be talking about serious violent offenses. But the data shows that very few teenagers of any age are engaged in the types of crime that we fear the most, the types of crime that make the headlines, that make the newspaper, right, that cause everybody to be afraid. Very few teenagers are actually involved in the homicide, rape, burglary, robbery, real robberies, and not the kind of foolishness that my client was charged with. And here's the deal, right? This is what's so important about the race and adolescent development, is that adolescence looks like adolescence all over the world. So teenagers do what teenagers do, not just in the United States, but all over the world, regardless of their class, regardless of their race. What do I mean by that? I mean that teenagers, and the research shows, right, that teenagers are impulsive, they're reactive, they're emotional, they are fairness fanatics, right? Kind of like Sharice was, right? They don't think ahead sometimes to the long-term consequences. They're risk takers, boundary testers, and peer influence is not a myth. Teenagers very often do what their friends do or what they think their friends are doing. And yet, we see that African American children are, notwithstanding the fact that everybody's doing the same thing, we see that African American children are disproportionately funneled into our criminal court systems and our juvenile court systems. The same is true with Latina youth across the country and other racial and ethnic groups. And so what we see is that teenagers, black teenagers in particular, are often criminalized for things that teenagers do and care about. So I think about, when I was a teenager, what did I care about? I cared about, to be quite frank, the clothes that I wore, the music that I listened to, the friends I got to sit with in the cafeteria, right? I cared about the parties that I got invited to. I wanted to have a good time. Black children get demonized for all of those things, right? So I think about clothes for a minute. If you think back, I know y'all read about, heard about, you're too young, but you've read about and heard about like the hippie era when folks used to wear tie-dye t-shirts, right? And smoke weed and wear the bell bottoms, right? Nobody outlawed a tie-dye t-shirt. Nobody said it was against the law to wear a tie-dye t-shirt, okay? Think about all black attire that is commonly associated with mass shootings, right? Nobody has ever outlawed all black clothes. Think about even today, right? Steel-toed Doc Martens with red shoelaces, which some white supremacist groups, male young white supremacist groups have adopted as their fashion statement. We've never outlawed that. But what have we outlawed? We have outlawed sagging pants in our country, right? It is against the law in some cities to wear sagging pants. Even if I don't want to see your underwear, I don't believe it should be against the law, such that a police officer can approach you about it, right? That's a different question. And then think about the hoodie. How many of us have on a hoodie in here, right? Okay, right? So, and even if the hoodie is not against the law, we know that to be a black child, right, and wear a hoodie is very often criminalized or demonized or perceived as a threat. When a young white woman can go to yoga class, right, in her hoodie and nobody bothers her. A white male can wear his hoodie to football practice and nobody bothers him. That's what we're talking about here. And then, even when black children do indeed commit some serious violent offenses, we see that society is far more likely to treat them as if they are completely beyond redemption. So you see that black children are far more likely to be prosecuted as an adult. They are far more likely to get some severe sentence like life without the possibility of parole. They're more likely to end up in solitary confinement if they go to prison. And so it is impossible really to think about the criminalization without also talking about police relationships in our country, right? And it starts with thinking about what are the roles of police in school. And I have to tell you all, before I wrote this book, I believed that police officers were sent to our schools in our country because everybody was afraid of the mass shootings back in Columbine, Colorado in 1999. But when I began to do research, I realized that police were actually sent to schools during the civil rights era in droves, right? The police were sent under the guise of creating a safe passage for Black and brown children who were beginning to integrate those schools. But we know from the iconic photographs and from the historical records that far too often police officers who were sent to schools in the civil rights era were an impediment to meaningful integration of schools, right? And then we fast forward to the 1990s, and in the 1990s, there are so many police officers, right? Before Columbine, the mass shooting in Columbine ever happens, there are so many police officers in schools, we have an entire National Association of School Resource Officers, right? And they have a mission statement, they have conferences, and then in the mid-1990s, the federal government decides to give states all across the country money if they will agree to hire police in schools. And the reason why the 1990s is so important is anybody remember what was going on? How many of you heard of the Central Park 5, right? Ava DuVernay's movie, right? Central Park 5, that was in the mid-1990s. In the mid-1990s, really, the folks went wild. They called Black children wilding, but the reality was the rest of the country went wild, and in that temporary moment where there was an uptick in crime in the mid-1990s, they labeled Black children super predators. And they decided, there was a professor who declared, based on some faulty research, that Black children were gonna run amok and rape, maim, and kill all of America by the year 2000. Number one, we know that never happened. Within 1 year of him coming up with this super predator myth, he had to recant it. He had to call it back because the research was so shoddy. But here's the problem. Once that label was out there, once it's all over the New York Times, once your former president, takes out a full-page ad in the New York Times, after that, the damage is done. And I have to tell you all 50 states changed their laws to make it easier to prosecute children as adults. And Black children became the explicit target of the super predator myth, right? Really huge impact on our society. That was all before Columbine ever happened. Then there was this mass shooting in Columbine, Colorado. And again, the federal government increased police in schools, but guess what? They didn't send the police in schools to schools in suburbs like Columbine, right? Or like Sandy Hook. They sent police officers to schools with a predominant Black and brown presence, right? Into the cities, right? So that the Columbine idea for police in schools was really just a myth. All right, so what we see now is that there are police in schools all over the country. More police in schools means more arrests in schools. More arrests in schools means more arrest of Black and brown students. Guess what the data shows? Black girls are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested in their school than a white girl. Black boys are 2.4 times more likely to be arrested in their school than a white boy. Hugely important, particularly for a child like my client, Sharice. And what's so tragic about it is having police, the research is really clear, counter to the myth or to popular belief, police in schools actually does not prevent school shootings. If you think about all of the recent contemporary school shootings, there have been police in those schools, right? Police are involved to solve crime. They have not been successful at preventing crimes in that way, which means we have to find other strategies short of police to achieve those goals. And so why did the officer, the school police officer in Washington, D.C., respond to my client, Sharice, the way that they did? Well, there was a whole lot of reasons for that. But one of the main reasons is the ways in which our racial biases, our society's biases, perceive Black children and Latino children. So y'all remember Tamir Rice, right? Tamir Rice is a 12-year-old boy who was shot in Cleveland, Ohio. But do people remember what the police officer said on the news, right? And the prosecutor said in the news when they explained why they shot him. People remember?
He had a toy gun.
They said he had a toy gun. What else?
Oh, they said he looked old for his age.
They looked old for his age. So the first thing was there was a radio run that says, or a 911 call that said a Black male with a gun. What most people do not know is that the 911 caller said in the moment, immediately, it's probably fake and it's probably a child. Those officers raced to the scene, and in less than 3 seconds, Tamir Rice was shot dead. And what they said was, just as you said, they told folks, well, he looked older. So this baby face that we see, apparently they couldn't see that, right? They started talking about how he was wearing an extra large jacket, 36 size pant, on and on. And here's the deal. The research shows that Tamir Rice is not alone. That across the country, both police officers and civilians tend to perceive Black boys as significantly older than they actually are. In fact, 4.5 years older than they actually are. So like a Tamir Rice ends up looking to be 17 years old, right? Instead of 12, perceived to be, right? Because we're not looking at that baby face. Or, a 17-year-old clients, like I represent often, end up looking like adults in their minds, right? 21, 22, 23 years old. Really important for us to think about what that means. Well, what it means is, I want to ask you guys, so when you look at this picture, right, can you tell me, I'm going to show you 2 pictures, who can bench press the most? Meaning, who can lift the most weight? Who is stronger? Is it him? Or is it him? Is it him? Or is it him? All right, I love this, right? So regardless of what we think our answer would be in a classroom like this, the research shows that people tend to perceive Black males to be bigger, taller, heavier, stronger, more muscular, even when they are the exact same size, exact same weight, and exact same body build as a white male, right? Always perceived to be bigger. Has a significant impact on the use of force and police decisions to act in a given situation. So look at these pictures. Y'all look up for a moment and tell me, do these kids look scary? Maybe. Do these kids look scary? Maybe. Do these kids look scary? Right? Well, the world thinks, I don't think they look scary, but the reality is, if you walk through a park, or if an average American walks through a park and they see a group of Black boys in a park, they're afraid, right? That's what we're talking about here. Why is that? It is because of the biases that live in our country. And so the research shows that Black youth in a group are far more likely to be stopped than a group of white kids in a group. And here's the real kicker. The really important part is that police officers are no more likely to find contraband, like drugs or like weapons, on a group of Black kids as they are on white kids. Contrary to popular belief. That's what the research shows, right? So, but our biases cause us to believe Black kids in a group are dangerous. Also, our biases in our country cause people to mistake something, to mistakenly believe that even a child as young as 5 years old, a Black child as young as 5 years old, is holding a weapon, like a gun, instead of a baby's rattle. So if you show, right, folks, a picture of a kid with some unknown object, or even an object they're holding as a baby's rattle, they are more likely to believe it is a gun, which is just tragic when you think about it. To be clear, similar research has been done involving Black girls showing that individuals are far more likely to believe that black girls are older, more mature, more knowledgeable about adult topics, less innocent, less in need of protection than white girls, right? Again, tragic, because it has significant impact on the ways in which teachers respond to black girls, the ways in which girls get suspended or arrested, like my client, Sharice. More generally, people are more likely to believe that some innocuous, unknown facial, ambiguous facial expression or ambiguous behavior associated with the black face is dangerous, while associating that exact same behavior or facial expression on a white face as harmless. All right, so look at this final set of pictures here. Look up. Is this child sad or angry? Angry. Is this child sad or angry? Right? Scared. I like that, right? Like sad, angry, scared, right? Traumatized by something, right? But yet, the research shows that adults are significantly more likely to misperceive sadness, trauma, disappointment, hurt, right, on a black child's face as anger. And those misperceptions also have a significant impact on school discipline and arrest in school. All right, so now that we understand how some of this criminalization happens in our schools and in our country, we need to think about, for a moment, how that criminalization impacts black children in all the ways I talked about, physically, developmentally, psychologically. And the research shows that police contact has an extraordinary psychological trauma on black and brown children during those adolescent teenage years. Teenagers, black and brown teenagers who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods, who attend heavily surveilled schools, and who have significant contacts with police report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They become hypervigilant, just meaning that they're always on guard, not trusting police officers. That distrust of police carries over to other adult authority figures who might be allies for them, like teachers, counselors, right? What's so powerful about the research is that it shows that this trauma occurs not just from being in direct contact with the police, but also from hearing about it or witnessing it on the street, in the community, among friends, family, people that you're close to, or even watching it on television, online, on the internet, right? So I always tell folks, remember exactly where you were when you watched George Floyd die in front of you, right? And think about how tragic that was. And when I'm not talking to a crowd of folks that looks all, very much like I do as a person of color, I remind them to think, what does it feel like? What would it feel like to watch that? The killing of George Floyd, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice? What does that feel like, right? If you're a black and brown person and you know this could happen to me too, right? And so the research talks about how even watching on television can cause post-traumatic stress disorder. What is so powerful about this study, this is really important for you all here in New Orleans, is that this study was designed after the Twin Towers collapsed in New York City, after the Boston Marathon bombing, and after Hurricane Katrina. And what they did was they studied people who had watched those, not locally, not present, but watched them on TV and on the internet, and found that even watching from a distance caused post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, they repeated these studies, for children who were watching, teenagers who were watching police brutality, and finding that the same sort of post-traumatic disorder and other types of trauma and stress were evident in those contexts as well. The other thing that the researchers found was that children who live in these heavily policed neighborhoods and schools and communities were really suffering with their sleep. And I'm gonna tell you, for those of you who are thinking about law school, I represent kids in court. I am always blown away when I go into court and I see my client sitting in the hallway sound asleep. And I ask other defense attorneys, they're like, oh yeah, my clients too. Well, this research really helped me understand, not only does that child feel, didn't sleep the night before, maybe because they're embarrassed, they're angry, they think it's unfair that they're in court, but also because they live in neighborhoods where they don't get a lot of sleep, right? Because they're dealing with the trauma. Either they have insomnia or just poor sleep quality. And then finally, as we think about this trauma research, we have to think about the ways in which, constant police contact, right? Constant surveillance has an impact on one's sense of like who they are, their own self-esteem, who they are, who they can become, and how they fit in society. But more importantly, here's what's really important. It is the fact that police contact, or I should say this, adolescence, our teenage years, are the times when our views about law and law enforcement really become fixed in our heads. So if we have really negative encounters with the police during those teenage years, then we are far more likely to distrust police in the future, resent police, not want to confide in police or trust police when we become adults. Has a huge impact on the way we are evolving as a society. And it actually, really, this notion of over-policing increases crime instead of reducing crime, as I mentioned earlier. So that's a lot of information. And before I sit down, I just want to say a couple of quick words about, so what do we do with that? What do we do with all this research on trauma and the history of policing in schools and the differential treatment between Black kids and other kids? So how do we use that to drive change? And I always think about 4 primary themes for change. One of which is we have to radically reduce the footprint of police in the lives of all children, but especially Black and brown children who have been so disproportionately targeted, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is we need to reinvest our money, right, away from traditional law enforcement strategies for public safety and instead invest in alternatives, which I'll say just a bit more about in a second. We also need to ensure and insist that in the rare circumstances when police do need to contact or be in contact with young people, they do so in ways that remind us all that children are children, right? We have to, even when you police children, you have to police them like they are children. And then finally, when children end up in the court system, every single person, whether it's a probation officer, a judge, a lawyer, every single person who comes in contact with that child has to remember that race matters, that adolescence matters, and that trauma matters when we work with young people. So what does that mean on a very practical level? It means that we need to have what we call a public health approach to safety. Instead of a law enforcement approach to safety, we need a public health approach to safety. That means we need to be developing relationships between adults and children, whether that's mentors, counselors, all of that. We need meaningful relationships. We also need to have restorative justice, meaning we need to bridge relationships that have been broken. We need a trauma-responsive approach. That means we need to recognize the trauma that many young people have experienced, and then it must be racially equitable. You got to treat all kids alike, because how many of you all know that Black and brown children know when they're being treated differently, right? Yes, of course they do. And so counselors, social workers, mental health providers, youth intervention, social emotional learning in the classroom that teaches young people how to engage with each other, smaller classroom sizes, behavioral support staff for teachers in the classroom, and in schools where there really is violence and not just the foolishness like my client was arrested for, like Sharice, but real violence. We need credible messengers and violence interrupters who can get into the schools and help children navigate what's happening. And so we need to call in trained professionals who can work with young people who have emotional disabilities or learning disabilities. We don't need police officers to go in school. The bottom line is we need to invest in children, families, and communities, not surveillance and law enforcement. As I said earlier, when police are involved, they need to be trained on adolescent brains, right? The research shows very few police departments across the country have any training, more or less adequate training on how to work with a teenager, how to de-escalate a teenager. They aren't getting trained on racial bias. And we need rules that limit to the use of force. And then the very final thing is that once children end up in court, we need to treat them like children. Nobody is bad, it's the worst thing they've ever done. And believe it or not, there is actually research or evidence-based approaches to working with young people, even in the most serious and repeat criminal behavior. So we can do so if we just invest our dollars correctly. All right, so the bottom line is we need to treat all children like children, and that includes Black and brown children. So thank you guys. I'm going to join these folks, and we're going to talk up here and then engage you in our conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Henning. Wasn't that a great and awesome presentation? When I was reading the book, I was just blown away. You did a great job on the research, and you documented what everybody felt.
Right.
That our children are being picked on. It's like everywhere they turn, if they do it, and when you said that, one of your examples is my hometown Shreveport, with the sagging pants. And I remember when they came out with this ordinance, my comment was, what about all these middle-aged white men that are members of the Y jogging downtown with no shirt and sagging pants? And we used to joke there are two types of sagging pants in society. One with older men who traditionally, had sagging pants, and one with younger men, but only one was criminalized. So I thought that was just a great example there. We have a co-moderator, Ms. Alexander.
Yes.
Trinity Alexander, is that
Hi,
right?
for those who don't know me, my name is Trinity Alexander. I'm a senior here at Dillard University. Thank you so much for your presentation. It really did coincide with your book, which I told you earlier when we were speaking. The book is great. You gave a lot of examples that I think anyone here can relate to. I feel that a lot of times when we explain the examples of what happens to young Black youths, we go back to the older examples, and it's hard for people of newer generations to relate to those examples. I'm so glad that you use instances such as the sagging situation or the instance of Tamir Rice and your current cases to help you relay the message. And I thought that was just amazing. That was a great way for you to coincide with the presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to point out, and I don't know if this happens everywhere, I know it's Shreveport, that there is a phenomenon of monster trucks. Everybody familiar with that? With big tires. Well, you know who's more likely to drive a monster truck, right? Young white men. But nobody criminalized it. When in fact, it makes your chances of getting hurt in an accident greater because the monster truck moves the bumper up higher, whereas normally you just bumper to bumper. And so I said, so if they're concerned about safety, it just didn't happen. So I was looking forward to your book, but I wanted to add that when white kids do things that kids will do, people can justify it. But for some reason, when Black kids do even just hair, it gets criminalized. What did your research find about that?
Yeah, I mean, just unequivocally, I, try to find stories, particularly in the first chapter, where white kids are doing things that really have serious violent outcomes, where folks die, and somehow we manage to find some excuse. Or some child, gets raped. We manage to find an excuse. And it's in two parts. One, it's in part because we believe in this notion of rehabilitation and redemption, and that a white child gets that second chance. And then to be brutally honest with you, I tell folks to think about Kyle Rittenhouse, right? Folks know what happened to Kyle Rittenhouse. I mean, he took 2 people's lives and severely injured a third person. And everyone, his mother, and rightfully so, his defense attorney wanted the world to see him as a teenager who got in over his head and had to act in self-defense. But I invite people to think about that story in a different color, right? Think about what would happen if a black child, right, gets a phone call from a friend and says, hey, come on out here to the corner because I'm afraid something's about to go down, right? Friend shows up and somebody passes him a gun for safekeeping. What's the first thing that happens? He gets shot dead for having a gun. Kyle Rittenhouse walked through the streets with an assault rifle and open, and nobody shot him down, right? Why does he go there? He goes because his friends called him over, right? Told him to come and help protect businesses in a Black Lives Matter protest, as if they needed help in the first place, right? He gets there, right? They give him his gun. He didn't come with the gun. A friend gave him that gun. Guess what? If you've ever seen the pictures of Kyle Rittenhouse and his friends, they look just alike. They're dressed just alike, right? But yet you never heard anybody call Kyle Rittenhouse a gang member, right? Even though that's exactly what they were doing. He's, just sort of the epitome of doing foolishness, adolescent foolishness. Same thing a black kid does. He gets labeled a gang member. He gets an enhanced sentence. Nobody thinks he's entitled to due process. Nobody thinks he's entitled to rehabilitation if he's found guilty. It's a radically different approach. And I'm not saying, none of it is justified, right? Like, I don't want any kid engaged in that kind of, violence where they end up with outcomes. But the difference in how we respect and value adolescence and that privilege of adolescence when you're a white kid, you get those chances. You get the benefit of the doubt, right? And you just don't get that when you're a black kid.
I've got a still phrase from my deceased mother. She and I were having this conversation once, and she said, "Now, boy, you say they taught you something up at Harvard, but I'm not sure if they taught you the right thing." I said, "Mom, what are you talking about?" She said, "Don't you know when whites make all these harsh laws, they're not making them for their kids. They're not stupid enough to apply them to their own kids. These laws are just being made for us. Did they teach you that?" Of course, I had to kind of defend myself, but her point I saw in your book, that the goal in these laws, even with the sagging, was to give police another opportunity to thrust themselves into the lives of our young people. Now, with the resource officers in school, I was not prepared for that. That was shocking. So suddenly you got our children can't even get an education without the reminder of law enforcement sitting right there. And psychologically, what did you find that the impact ongoing and long term from that?
Yeah, very much like what I talked about there, which is the trauma, the psychological trauma, the ways in which police presence in schools undermines school climate, right? Makes many Black and brown children not want to come to school, right? And so what we found was, and there's a lot of research documenting that, police presence in many schools reduces school attendance, reduces, instruction time, leads to more kids being expelled or referred out to the system, and all of that psychologically has an extraordinary impact on young people and their ability to perform well in school.
Your book did a good job of pointing out at a developmental stage, when they're developing their identity, they're developing who they are, they're having thoughts about society. It's like the book is entitled The Rage of Innocence, and I kind of thought it was really the abduction of innocence. That the kids never had a chance to just think what they wanted to think about police. The police have just made themselves think negative thoughts. And I'm like, that's crazy. But I think our co-host has a question.
Yes, I'm glad that y'all started talking about the school resource officers. I've talked about this before. We had those resource officers in my school, and it seemed like those officers escalated the violence. So I want to know, do you feel like, I know you said that having the resource officers in the schools, it causes a decrease in the attendance and engagement in academics. Do you also feel that having those officers in school, having the students see these officers, increases the level of violence or criminal activity, kind of like the broken windows theory suggests?
Absolutely, and there's definitely been that has been documented as well, that in large part because of one of the things that I noted is that police officers are not trained. Right? We don't need police officers to raise children or regulate the behavior of children because they are not equipped. Another thing, very often, this is not always true, but very often many of the police officers who get sent to schools are young. They are very, barely older than the kids themselves, right? So this stuff about the emotional, and impulsivity aspects of adolescence are still there until the age of 25. So a lot of it's lack of training. A lot of it is, they don't have the psychological capacity to deal with it. Also, it is literally because when you put a police officer in school, right, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So you put a law enforcement officer in school, they're going to do very law enforcement things. So I talk about police officers theoretically are sent to be like sort of the big brother, the officer friendly, but the only tools they have in their toolbox usually, very often are, to arrest, right, to use physical force. We have seen, story after story where an encounter between a police officer and a child in school goes from 0 to 100 in an instant, right? The kid talks back, right? As teenagers sometimes do, and it becomes physical, right? Body slamming of kids in school, hog-tying children in school, a range of things, And then for the younger children, even handcuffing children under the age of 10 is very traumatic. Those kinds of resources, because that's what police officers are trained to do.
I wanted to share a personal experience. I saw it in your book, and it was almost verbatim. I was driving once, and I was in an African-American neighborhood, and I got to this corner, and to my right, I had my left signal on, and to the right was a truck with a police car followed it. So I said, well, he's going to stop that car because they're close. So I put my right signal on and made a right turn. I looked up, the police car was behind me. I said, no, it must be a coincidence. So I drove a little bit and pulled into a driveway. The police came down the street. And so when I came back out the driveway, the police came and put his lights on. I said, officer, what are you stopping me for? He said, suspicious behavior. I said, for driving? He said, well, you put your left signal on and you turn right. I said, but I put my right signal. He said, yeah, you did. I said, so what's suspicious about that? He said, I didn't know what you were doing. And so when I saw in your book, what it was really, the police were really saying is, if I don't know what you're doing from their standpoint, which how could they know what I'm doing because they're not in the car? They saw that as suspicious. They were targeting our young people. And I was just thinking, what traumatization? How do we stop that?
You asked the $1 million question there because that is really deeply embedded, racial bias, the presumptions, ambiguity, right? When I don't know an answer, I presume the worst. I presume threat. I presume violence. And that's what the research shows, again and again. And I think with regard to young people, how do we begin to address that? Part of it is, really is educating, right? Educating folks on officers on this kind of bias. And I'm very, very clear, training alone is not enough. But officers need to be aware of how biases permeate society without, blaming them or faulting them, but making sure they understand that you've lived in a country that from its very foundation
exactly
was built on narratives, built on stories that Black folks were lazy, dangerous, and a threat to white women, right? And so that was very explicitly seen in our country from the era of in the enslavement of Black people to the lynching era, to the 1990s, right? And so that we have to do the work of resisting those biases. I also say to folks, and it's very tricky because I often say to crowds, I feel like I'm very uncomfortable saying it to police officers, but to crowds, you've got to get proximate. Like you got to get close to young Black people, young Black children who are thriving, to see them, to see that kids, are just like your kids. Black kids are just like your kids. Latina kids are just like your kids, but you're not close to them unless they're in the criminal justice system, right? So when you only see a kid, right, in a negative context, it reinforces all the stereotypes we have. So you've got to find ways to engage with young people in ways that show their brilliance and their vibrance and their laughter and their joy. And that's hard to do as police officers. So I am not, people are going to hate me for saying this, I am not advocating like police athletic leagues, right? Where police officers show up in a police uniform and play basketball. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about the ways in which in plain clothes, when you're off duty, you're going to church, you're going to recreation facilities, you're being yourself in proximity with young people to see them who they are, which is a very different phenomenon.
I'm so glad that you talked about that a little bit, because it goes into my next question. So aside from police officers getting close to youths and being educated on their biases and how what they're seeing on Black individuals and other minorities can affect these children, how do you think young adults such as myself and any of my colleagues, how can we assist in helping the younger youths know that you can be targeted but also without traumatizing them besides mentorships?
So it's a really, really good question, and I sometimes say this to Black parents. It's equally true to Black, mentors. You all are mentors. Is that it is a really difficult task to balance between you've got to let folks know the talk, right? Put your hands up, do whatever you got to do to get home safe. A police encounter might be risky, it might be dangerous, but at the same time, we are a people. We are a people who have navigated our way through injustice, and we've done so. So what we talk about is really educating Black folks on our Black heroes, our Black leaders, our racial pride is a way to offset all of that discrimination. So I think there are several things you can do at your age, which is creating space for teenagers in a local high school to talk about some of these issues, right? Talk about what they're experiencing in their community, maybe what they're experiencing in their classes, in their schools, and to come up with what would you want to see differently, right? So creating space for high school students or elementary or middle school students to be activists in their own ways. So, and we've seen it all across the country. Teenagers, took a knee, in their school. People marched, young students marched after George Floyd was killed. Those were young folks, teenagers at the front. But we have to create space for young people to have those conversations. So I think that's one really important way, helping them design. We've done it in our high schools in DC, where sometimes, like even with the book, The Rage of Innocence, we send them chapters, high school students copies of 2 chapters of the book, and say, we want you to do 2 things. We want you to read and figure out what strategies for reform would you do for police in schools or for police trauma, and we want you to have a debate. One person take one side, one person take the other, like school uniforms, or you talked about black hair, having folks come and debate, students debate whether or not it's appropriate to have rules that prohibit wearing your hair in certain ways, right? Have that as a debate. That's really important for young people.
Thank you so much.
I like wearing my African garb, and part of the reason is what you talked about in your book, that in our own way, sometimes African Americans have radicalized dress.
Yeah.
And when I first started, I got so many comments that were negative. Even one close relative said I was appropriating African culture. I said, I'm African. But then we got to thinking that if we don't, then when we just do it at extraordinary times, people treat it as a radical rather than just an expression. But your book raised something else that was kind of a little troubling. Emotionally disturbed young people. And that's kind of where it's a little difficult. Because a lot of young people have issues. They're on medication or should be on medication. They've been traumatized. They've grown up and been victimized. They've been molested. They've been physically abused. And they've got emotional issues. So there needs to be some kind of intervention. So how do you deal with that? Yeah. And I know the police have said it's tough. The community has said it's tough. And in many cases, I think in several cases with your book, the families themselves have reached out to police to say, I need help. So can you kind of address how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, so there are several things. I mean, you're absolutely right. I want to be, super clear that the data in schools show that youth with disabilities are significantly more likely to be arrested in school instead of treated in school. And Black and Latino youth with disabilities are 3 times more likely than the rest of the population to be arrested in schools, right? Because our response is a traditional law enforcement response.
Indeed.
Instead of intervening. Beyond the school and in the community, you see the exact same thing that adults, we just saw recently, what's his name, Tyrion, the gentleman who was killed when he was escorted into a mental health hospital, a very hospital which is supposed to be equipped and trained to deal with him, and deal with him is the wrong word, to serve him, to care for him,
To address his
treat
needs,
him,
right.
to address his needs, literally defaulted to a criminalized response. They first of all called in police officers in to navigate that situation, as opposed to mental health professionals. And think about it. When you see pictures of him, he was a bigger man, very much like Mike Brown out of Ferguson. And I tell people all the time, and be clear, Mike Brown, there's no indication that he had mental health issues, but the parallel is this. Mike Brown was 18 years old. People, when I wrote the book, I included Mike Brown, and people say, well, he's an adult. He was an adult. No, he wasn't. How many of y'all know an 18-year-old is still, evolving and learning? Their brain is still developing. He's every bit of a child. The gentleman who was just killed in the mental health hospital was also a teenager, right? And we forget that because of what did I talk about earlier, those racial perceptions. They are perceived to be bigger, stronger, heavier, older than they actually are. And so the fear is the only way I can engage this person with mental health challenges and disabilities is to physically use force or to call in a law enforcement officer instead of using every single thing that we've been trained to use with children with disabilities and emotional disorders. We can, Stephon Watts in Chicago, I mean, there are kid after kid after kid who has been killed by the police because, kids with autism, kids with Asperger's, kids with speech and language, disabilities who are shot and killed by the police because of those disabilities. And I write about not just those high-profile stories, but also in the book, I actually have clients who literally, had some mental health breakdown or a psychotic episode and were arrested and criminalized for that. Instead of having someone call a mental health mobile crisis unit. It is not that radical to think that there is another way to resolve and to intervene.
What came to mind is, does the children have the right to be sick?
Right.
Humans have the right to be sick. That comes along with being humans. But what you see is when they got sick, their very illness and the playing out of the illness got criminalized. And I was just shocked, and I'm glad you're here to say, but part of it, you think part of it is the screening. There's just certain officers, in my experience, they just never should have been officers. Then there's certain officers who come to the table looking for the opportunity to take advantage of.
So I will say this, I think that is, so yes and. I think that, to be honest with you, that's a small piece of the problem. I do think police screening and training is unequivocally an issue. But the bigger issue is our entire cultural perspective. We default to policing for everything.
Right.
For drug intervention, mental health intervention, getting my cat out of the tree. I got locked out of my car, schools and regulating teenagers. So it's our country as a culture, we default to, traditional law enforcement.
And why is that?
I mean, I honestly, I don't know that I have a clear answer for that, but you have to understand that from the very founding of this country, we relied on law enforcement intervention and surveillance, even if it didn't look like the blue uniform, right? Think about how the overseers, right? Those were the earliest forms of, policing in our country. So I don't know, but if you do a comparative analysis, for those of you who are interested in international and comparative studies, right? Look at other countries. They have, have not defaulted to that traditional law enforcement approach. So
It's almost like the police has been viewed as a sick 'em dog. Something happens, you call the police, sick 'em, come get this person. And it's as if their behavior has to be a certain way, and if it's not a certain way, you should be incarcerated. Now, let me ask you this. In your book, I looked for it, I didn't see it. And you may have left it out for a reason. In the Bible, there are two incidents that people refer to explain. One is the one with the birth of Moses, that before the birth, the Pharaoh says, kill all the male babies, and then in the birth of Jesus. And it was this notion that they represented a future that the Pharaoh didn't want to see come about. And as I was reading your book, it was like every instance there was some law that basically said, take this child out.
yeah.
Even if they committed a minor offense, like the young lady, the guy didn't even complain about, but you thrust them into the criminal justice system, and the impact is going to be that they're going to have a psychological and some type of shackle on their future. So I kind of thought about those. Do you think that may have been intentional or purposeful?
Yeah. And I actually do reference it. I don't use the biblical analogy, but in the very introduction to the book, I say
I skipped the introduction.
Oh, okay. But that it is no coincidence. That it's no coincidence that some of the most high-profile incidences of police violence and civilians' violence against Black males occurred during those teenage years.
Yes.
And involved Black male teenagers precisely because it was intentional, right? Like that the idea is that what better way and what better time in the developmental stage to limit the opportunity, the possibility, the hope, the prospect, the vision of Black youth than by criminalizing them.
And when you looked at you had several instances with whites in the criminal justice system and the lenience that they got. And I remember I was in law school, this issue came up, that discretion is wrought in the system. And one of the elements of discretion with the judge is to determine, what's your chances of being rehabilitated, but also what's your future value to society. And that when you frame it that way, it's easy to say this white student, male or female, from a good family with resources, their behavior is not going to happen again because they represent some kind of future. But when you look at a Black child, it's easy to say, oh no, let's go ahead and throw them away. How do we deal with that? We got to deal with that, so how do we do it?
I think we deal with.
We begin to address it with young folks, Trinity here and like all of you, right? Being that light that brings that shepherd that really reaches back and works with the young people, and being that light and that shepherd that shows the rest of the world, though it shouldn't be our burden, shows the rest of the world the value, the promise, and the hope of what young Black America, looks like. And so, look, I think there are a lot of, reforms that I talk about on the screen, but in a lot of ways, those are just sort of tinkering around the edges, regulating police, training police, when we have to have a radical cultural shift. And so I like to throw it back to the Trinities and you of the world to tell your stories, right? And to tell your stories of how, you experienced trauma and discrimination, but also how resilient, you have been and what you need as a young people to stay resilient and to thrive in this country. So I think that's very much what needs to happen.
You have any questions, Ms. Alexander?
I do. So I know you touched on a little bit about the reform of training and how we can have police officers have extensive training and have mental health professionals have extensive training on how to treat young children. So do you think that your book can be used as a guide in a way to help train these professionals on how they should behave around children and to help educate them? And in what ways do you think that your book can be used in that aspect?
Unequivocally, and I say often that so many people just don't know what they don't know, really, and that juvenile courts across the country are closed-door proceedings. They're confidential proceedings. And so the myth is, right? So the stories, what we believe about juvenile court comes from the media. So my hope is that a book like this does indeed that. It helps, one, for the people who are already in the system, working in the system, whatever role, probation, judge, lawyer, that they see and remember what it was like to be a teenager, right? So I tell people all the time, you could find yourself somewhere in one of these stories and remember what you did, what silly thing that you did as a teenager, and you came out just fine, right? And so I want people to remember that. I want people to see the research, all the people that you're talking about. I want them to see the research to show that Black children aren't any different. There is some myth that somehow Black adolescence and Latino adolescence looks different than adolescence everywhere else in the world. And it doesn't in the fundamental ways, right? Like the key features of resilience and impulsivity. Yes, context does matter. If you grow up in a very traumatized community, your adolescence looks different. But what I hope in this book is that even when your neighborhood looks different, that you will see the research showing that rehabilitation, resilience are still possible, even in the most difficult, violent, and impoverished neighborhoods, right? So if you can be that, mentor, you can bring that child out of that. So, yeah.
And also, how do you think this can affect young children who may have not grown up to experience any form of trauma? They may not know that they're being targeted. They have not seen it. Like, for instance, I'm from New Orleans, so I've seen this my entire life. But someone may be from the suburbs of a completely different state on the other side of the country, and they may have not experienced anything. They may be engaging with individuals and police officers and professionals who don't seem to target them, but there is some type of racial bias. So how can we expose them to that before them experiencing it themselves and then eventually crashing down?
It's such a good, I talk about this a bit in chapter 5 of the book, this exact scenario, this idea that there are young people who haven't. I think fewer and fewer and fewer, Black children, can get much into their teenage years without experiencing some kind of discrimination, but that we as a people kind of have to help our young people understand that these things may happen, but Rosa Parks, stood up for you. And that Thurgood Marshall, advocated for you, and that, just do what you have to do to stay safe in the moment, but then come back and tell your teachers, tell your mentors, tell your coaches, tell your parents, tell your family, and then together you can mount a response, right? So that we don't want you to react and be violent in the moment, even when it's entitled, even when you have a right to be angry. That just keep it together in the moment, and then we'll figure out. But we have to be there for them and help them figure it out, right? Like, we can't stay silent in the face of what we see. And so I tell, the story, you talk about how young it is that Black children end up having to confront discrimination and bias. I think about Jeremiah Harvey. Y'all may not remember this story, but that's the 9-year-old child. Do y'all remember this? Where in Brooklyn, New York, he was in a bodega, right? And a white woman said that she touched that he touched her on the butt. She literally accused a 9-year-old of sexually groping her in a convenience store. And what it turns out, they pulled the video from the from the bodega, and they found that he had just walked in the store with his book bag on his back, and his book bag accidentally brushed along her behind, right? He didn't even look at her. He didn't even see her. He didn't even pay attention to her. But she construed that as a sexual assault. Call the police, right, on her. And the thing about not remaining silent is that people who were in that bodega literally, sort of went off on her. How dare you make that presumption? And then he And his mother went on television and shared the story. And they sobbed for folks to understand what's happening. So at 9 years old, to be the presumption when there's something unknown that happens behind your back, the presumption when I turn around and see a 9-year-old black child, he must be a sexual predator. That is entirely about bias.
What do you think would have happened if they had charged her with filing a false police report?
So that's interesting. So one of the strategies that has been offered across the country is the false 911 or the Karen laws, which, honestly, I think that's tinkering around the edges too, right? Like you can do that as a symbolic statement. So it may be important, and Brooklyn did try to pass some temporary legislation or some legislation indicating that, it's improper, or you can be criminally liable or civilly liable, have to pay a fine if you, make unfounded accusations. I don't know whether that does the work.
But I know you feel like it's not going to solve the whole problem, but sometimes you got to eat that a little bite at a time.
Right, and it's symbolic. It certainly makes the statement that we're not going to stand for that. So there is some value to it.
Right. Now, what you were saying earlier, I wanted to repeat to young people, and many of us who've done civil rights law comment on this, that all too often young people are fighting battles on the scene and at school that adults should be fighting. And that young people should just wait. You're waiting doesn't mean you're putting up with. You're just waiting until you can fight it on your terms, with your parents there and with professionals there. Then you can come back, because arguing with the police on the spot is just not ever going to work out good. Not ever, because the police is there and you don't have witnesses, and they're going to give their narrative to the story, and unless there is some kind of surveillance or videotape, their story, regardless of how outlandish it's going to go. So to young people, just know you could fight that battle another day. You hadn't given up on it, you haven't given in. It's just recognizing that you just don't have the right resources at that moment, so to kind of wait. Any other comments? We have any questions from our audience?
I understand that you are a professor at Georgetown Law, and from visiting Georgetown Law, I always see a lot of microaggressions from their professors, especially with race and black students. Did you get any backlash after publishing your book?
So, notwithstanding this is so funny, notwithstanding, again, what gets put out in the news, because we've had some high-profile moments that were really problematic. Actually, Georgetown is a pretty liberal school. It's shocking, but Georgetown Law School in particular is full of folks who write stuff like what I write. Paul Butler, who's on the news, Cheryl Cashin, Dorothy Brown, I could go on and on and on. So quite the opposite. People applauded the writing of this. People held events at the law school. So it's shocking, but notwithstanding the media, those folks who, not to say, let me be very clear, that even liberal, folks of all races have microaggressions against black folks. Okay, so I don't want to overstate that point. I don't want to be misunderstood. But that as a institution, by and large, we have very few sort of conservative faculty, and so that the microaggressions are about people who don't know what they don't know. People who haven't been adequately trained to be respectful, thoughtful, culturally sensitive, well-educated about people who don't look like them. So, which is just as harmful and just as painful for black students, but it's definitely not rooted in our ideology. So there's no backlash there at all. It's a great question.
Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna close my eyes and just point at somebody. Gentleman on the front row.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Clarence Bickman. I work with Juvenile Court.
Oh, great.
And in listening to your discussion, just want to say some things that we're doing here in New Orleans. First of all, we have several venues at our court that deals with restorative justice. So that's one of the things that we're working on. And just this about a couple of weeks ago, we teamed up with Center for Racial Justice, where we did a citywide youth forum here at Georgetown University based on Know Your Rights and Make Your Rights. And we talked about the 4th and 5th amendments to the Constitution, where young people will know their rights whenever they are accosted or stopped by police. So that's one of the things that we're pushing, so that we figure that as long as young people know their rights, I don't have to say anything. I refuse to talk. I want my lawyer. Am I being held? Am I free to go? With all these type of things, because a lot of times we see that they coerce young people and, well, why was you running? Well, you see, I was running because, no, you don't have to say anything. So we're trying to get them to understand their rights. So once they understand their rights, they tend to not to be afraid of police. You can ask them their name or their badge number. And because they're a public service, they have to give you certain information. But so that's where we're working from. That's the aspect we're working from, because I've been with juvenile court 12 years. And in the 12 years, I only had 2 white kids. Now let me tell you this one case, just had a couple of, about last year. A white young man doesn't stay in New Orleans, stay in Metairie, Louisiana. It's a little up the road a little ways, predominantly white area. Borrowed a friend's car, came down to New Orleans for a party, and the car he borrowed was a Mustang, no, a Camaro. Now he's a 15-year-old white boy driving a Camaro. Now you know what he's gonna do. So after the party, he decided to show off. He was skirting, tried to drive off fast, and he hit a young white girl. She was a senior in high school. She had a body cast on for a couple months. She missed a high school prom, missed a high school trip, missed graduation, and guess what? That case was bumped down to juvenile court, in juvenile court to my program, which is teen court. First time nonviolent offenders. Now I had to deal with that situation. Now, what happened was the family of the young man was saying, no, he didn't know what he was doing. He was young and stupid, you know. But the parents of the young lady, they felt that he should have had a harsher sentence because vehicular homicide or something of that nature, as opposed to him just being slapped on the hand and sent to teen court. So that goes to bail out what you're saying about how, now, what if that would have been an African-American male? They hit a white young lady and driving off in a car fast. You know, I mean, he'd still be in jail. But that's the system we are. Also, one other thing that I wanted to say, that we have a $25,000 trauma center that we built inside the court. So a lot of young people, when they come to court, they're able to go to a trauma center, and their family go to the trauma center and help them out, so that when they do go to court, they're able to act a certain way or understand a certain thing that was going on at that place. And Dr. Ishmael has been an advocate to work with juvenile court to help form reforms. So that's what we're trying to do here in New Orleans.
I appreciate all of those reforms. So thank you so much for the work that you do, and especially for having a trauma-informed center. I will say this. My one friendly amendment, can we have that trauma-informed center not connected to the court and have it in the community so that I don't have to get arrested in order to get those services, you know? But I love the framework. I love what you're doing with it. I also really, what resonated with me is the fact that you're able to tell a story. First of all, that you've been working in the courts as long as you have and have had 2 white kids. I've been working in the courts as long as I had and had 4 white kids. That is huge. This is not like anecdotal evidence in little, you know, like that we're telling. This is data from like across the country. Yes, there are states that have predominantly white children in court in terms of raw numbers, but even then, if you look at the raw numbers of black kids, they are disproportionately higher presence in courts. So it's the fact that we're telling the same story from the east to the west to the north to the south is huge. And I want to ask a question to the group, if you don't mind. By a show of hands, did anything that we talked about today or that I talked about in my presentation, did it resonate with what you've seen in your school? Anybody? Yeah. Just about everybody. That's pretty huge, right? To think about. And why is it wherever you came from that we see the same problems over and over and over again? So it's definitely worth thinking about. I also, would anybody be willing to share one or two things out here that resonated, that sound like what you've seen and experienced in your high school or even here in your city? Can anybody do that for me? Just so we can hear. He shared his, I've shared mine. You don't have to tell about your own story. Anybody? There are a lot of hands. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, my name is Marissa Pittman. I'm a junior here at Juvenile University, and I'm also a Young Leader Fellow for Cities United, which is a national organization that works to address the root causes of violence in Black men and young boys through policy work with the public health approach. So a lot of what you said as far as using public health to drive the policy reforms are things that I work on a day-to-day basis. Also, I'm originally from Memphis, so I've done a lot of community organized work around police reform specifically. And one of the things that I noticed is that school resource officers definitely were aggressors in a lot of the situations. The high school I went to, we had serious violence. For instance, there was actually a fight that we had, I think the year before my freshman year, where they were stomping on girls' heads, and it went viral on CNN. But I say that because after that, we had a really big examination of the culture that we had at our school, and it made us realize that school resource officers really didn't help. Right. And that would be the main moment to really jump in when you see students in that crisis. And so from there, we had more of a trauma-based approach. We had more social workers, and we worked more on the mental health of our students to address the root causes of that violence, as opposed to just reacting once it had already happened.
So much of what you said strikes me. So glad you're connected to this work. It's like something, I said earlier to Trinity, youth organizing is huge, right? The voices of young people makes all the difference. The second thing, that you said that's really important, which is really almost is a tragedy, but it's the reality is capitalizing on those moments. Mobilizing around high-profile incidents like you described are absolutely essential to bring about reform. Get people to make reform when there's a tragedy. I want us to figure out as a society how to do that without another Black child dying or another brown child dying. That's what we need to do. So part of this storytelling, right, like the writing of a book like this, is to tell stories, before somebody dies, right? Like, how do I tell that? Get people riled up. But I so appreciate and love what you're doing. There's a lot of work to be done in Memphis. I was just in Memphis and been there quite a few times around some of these issues. And then Rutherford County, Tennessee, which is not too far, had that huge incident where they were arresting 8-year-olds, putting them in detention for crimes, they weren't crimes, for behaviors that did not even constitute a criminal offense. That was one of the most outrageous stories that has ever come out in the country, literally. These are lawyers, judges, police officers who are supposed to know the law, and we're arresting an 8-year-old child, multiple children, for watching a fight, not participating in a fight, but for watching a fight. And then they arrested them, held them in detention for behavior that wasn't even a crime on the books. So there's a lot going on across the country.
I'd like to hear from other young people on what can you do and how can we get young people more involved. It's your future we're talking about. It's your present. So you got to get more engaged. So how can we hear from young people? How can we get more young people to take a stand now? Get one hand in the back. Even if you're young, and we're going to call on you. Can you stand up, please? Thank you.
Kids that are doing the sit and wait approach, and I don't think that has been proactive or beneficial
Oh, yeah.
How are we being impactful and mindful with the things and the language that we're using? Because I think that it can just be a little problematic when we say, wait for the resources. And while that might come from a place of safety, I just don't think that, we specifically in social justice and stuff like that are really the kids for that. I think that all of us that want to go to law school and make those changes, I think that when you are a change maker, like, you're not really to sit and waste time.
Yeah.
And so I think just encouraging and uplifting us and our voices in a way that is safe and is led with intention, I think is the best way to support us in what we are currently doing. Because us all being here, being in college, doing our next steps, graduating, that is the change that we are encouraging by our actions.
So, amen. Let me be, yes. And I really want to be super, super clear. I want to profusely apologize if what you heard, what I said, not even what you heard, what I said was, huh?
Just,
can I please though?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So because I really firmly believe the entire chapter 12 of this book is around youth activism and youth resilience,
exactly.
and all of the ways that you talk about social media, and the ways in which even Black protest is criminalized. So 100%. I think I started it. I think I understand what you're saying, picking up. But
I want to clarify.
Can I please? Sorry. Which was this idea was only the safety, the front, but not about waiting for resources, but figuring out ways, to safely say, not even respectfully, I refuse to use that word, but to speak out to authority, hopefully in the moment, without getting killed. And I also very firmly believe it's not your responsibility to sit and wait, right? Like, I agree with that. We as a society have to create space and platforms and give you those space and platforms to do that work. Even in the moment, I know that Black parents, Black teachers worry about police officers killing children for speaking out, in the moment in ways that they can't hear. But I 100%, every way in which you can speak out, and I advocate firmly in a contempt of cop, that even speaking out to police officers is a form of protest that has to be respected. So I just wanted to praise you for that comment.
And let me just clarify that too, if I spoke too broadly. What I'm speaking from is having represented parents of young men who have been killed, who were stopped for minor traffic violations. And then that confrontation escalated. And then the officer said, I thought he had a gun, I thought he was going for a gun, and he ended up dead. And one of the experiences was if they were right that they were wrongfully being targeted, but to try to argue with that person on the spot is what I was saying is not really wise. That's only, I'm not saying wait to address the big issue or wait till you get older. I'm just saying just at that moment, and that's just from my experience. And so I understand, yours may be differently, but when I was young and we would be in a neighborhood that's not our neighborhood, and I tell this story often, people would say, your mama did so-and-so, or your mama, and we'll say, I look around, there's 10 of them and one of me, and I say, yeah, you're right. And our notion was, let's live to see another day. And then I could address that at another time. But my big point is that, and I totally agree with you, and that was a point of my question, to say young people need to get engaged now and not wait.
And I actually want to add something I think is so powerful about what you said, is that think about Rosa Parks as an example. She put her life on the line, arguably, right? And all of the children who marched, the Children's March during the Civil Rights era, spoke out in the moment, even at great risk to themselves. So maybe even parents and teachers shouldn't even be saying, calm down in the moment. It's that you got to do what your heart leads you to do to make and bring about great change. So I'm so happy to have you.
Any other comments, questions? Sure.
He wants the microphone. So. I'm gonna just sit right here. Hi, my name is Alexis Campbell. I'm a graduating senior, criminal justice major. Going back to what you said about like what resonated with us throughout the book,
just you acknowledging, first I want to say thank you for acknowledging the fact that mental health matters before, during, and after the fact of police presence, especially in the lives of young men. I can't even like count, you know, on all of my hands how many times I've heard, you know, a black man say, oh, I'm gonna take this route because, you know, I see police, or it get like really tense when they're driving and a police car is next to them, or even like things that aren't even directly affecting them, and how you talked about there being like PTSD from just seeing and watching situations on TV. So I just wanted to thank you, and as a reader, I appreciate you for pointing that out, because I think a lot of the times we get so caught up in the present moment of having encounters with police officers that we forget that there's consequences that come after that. So again, I just thank you.
Excellent. I love it. Thank you for, you know, highlighting and caring about it. And I love your framing about how mental health matters before, during, and after. So I might actually steal that phrase and credit you appropriately. But that's a wonderful summary. Before, during, and after. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Any other questions or comments? I just want to say thank you so much, and also for what Alexis said. I'm glad that she noted the situations where black men or black women don't like to go in certain areas. I know sometimes when my daddy and I are driving around, we be like, oh, we can't go to West Wego today because something could happen in West Wego. We don't go to West Wego. We don't ever go to West Wego.
Wow, that's deep.
Yeah, we never go to West Wego. Or there's other places that we don't go. There's places that my mom and we never go. Like for instance, we were looking for a new house. My mama wanted to go to Belchase because it was nice, but I was like, we can't go to Belchase. If we go to Belchase, one of us is gonna die.
Exactly.
So it's just the fact that that's happening so much, and me being only 20 years